welcome to Quirky Queen's Journals. My name's Kirsten. So today I am using 16 by 20 inch acrylic paper, indigo, lemon yellow, cadmium red deep hue paint, plus titanium white paint, a range of brushes, a tub of water and some scratchy tools, just a couple of skewers and a sort of wooden pointy thing, and some gesso. So I'm going to make an abstract floral acrylic painting and let's get started. Okay, acrylic paper's already actually prepared for you. You don't need to gesso it. It's got a slight canvas feel. However, I wanted to make a very kind of red hot background because this painting is based on a visit to the botanical gardens, which had a hothouse with like cacti and palm trees, etc. in it. And so that's kind of what the inspiration for this picture was. Although it is from imagination, but it's because I'd just been there. So anyway, I mixed the gesso, the cadmium red deep hue, made this background, lots of brush marks, lots of texture. Not texture as in meaningful texture, just the brush marks have gave texture. Now I'm using a pencil to just sort of mark out a very basic large shape composition, just to give me something to start with. So I've decided on a kind of clump of big leaves at the top right, and then kind of more like a loose strands of flowers on the left hand side, and then we'll get into it, you'll see it. So I'm using the indigo paint just to paint this outline again, so that we can actually see it. And also the pencil mark's a guideline. This indigo paint is a guideline. I find that with each layer we do, what happens is we get more defined with each layer. At this stage, we're getting the feel for the paper, the paint, we're mixing colours together. I do have those tubs. I have 3 tubs that I go between for mixing the paints. Because they're acrylic paints, they do dry fast, but I do keep them wet. I just spray them with water. I put the lids on them and I just keep mixing as I go. I use these 3 colours together a lot, so I'm actually very used to what I need to put in proportion-wise to create something along the colour that I do want. For example, like a limey yellow-green or a more dark emerald green type, maybe. Anyway, you can see the outline there. So I the other thing is I've been trying to do some learning, and it's about, I'm having the big shapes, I'm trying to have some repetition in there, but I'm trying to change the size, the direction, the kind of, the looseness of it. I'm just trying to provide cohesion through repetition, but at the same time having variety with that repetition. And you'll see what I mean as we go. So I absolutely loved working on top of this hot pink, which is the only way I can describe it, background colour. It was much easier than working on white, and it's like your warms were already in place, so it was really just about defining your cools. So I'm blocking in some of the large shapes with the sort of colour choices that I want for them. So I've already done like a sort of sketch, and I've used some kids' poster paint to kind of mark out the colours and, you know, the sort of bigger shapes that I want to work with. Now, one thing I do, as you can see there, that I was patting the paintbrush rather than sort of flowing it across the paper. And that's because I'm wanting to make a kind of almost thin woody strand. So I wanted it to have a bit of stiffness but also a bit of flexibility, and I want to show the kind of ridges. So that's why I patted that there. And this is where the variety of the paintbrushes come in as well, because for all they're of fairly similar sizes. They're all quite small with a couple of mediums in there. But I've got different heads, so I've got like pointed ones, I've got stiff bristles, I've got soft bristles. I've got paintbrushes that hold more water than other ones, so they're a bit easier to put out a more transparent shade of the paint. Not shade, version of. Like, you know, a more watery fluid paint rather than a sort of thicker. Like, for example, in the top right-hand side, that's quite thick, that kind of woody strand that I made, the paint that I've made that with. Whereas where I was working just there and there, it's more watery. So you can see the variety of colours already, and we've only just started. The different shades of greens and purples and kind of browns that we've got going already. So aside from kind of giving a sort of baseline with the shapes and the colours and maybe a bit of, you know, texture in the structure, the other thing that we're doing here is I'm very much building up layers of colour, because it's actually the negative painting that's going to really shape this painting. So what I'm doing is I'm laying down colour and it looks quite messy, it's very loose, it's, you know, its edges are a bit all over the place. But then as that's drying, I come in and I add more layers on top. And what I'm hopeful is that when I do cut in with the negative painting at the end, that, you know, there's a lot of depth of colour in there and it looks a lot more natural than it would if I'd just tried to sort of paint each sort of structure of the plant as it is, if that makes sense. So basically I'm laying down lots of sort of colours and textures that go with the plants that I want to go with the plants. And then, you know, at the end when we cut in, I do a bit of negative painting at each stage as we go through, because I kind of build the picture up while I'm kind of doing full layers all the way. At the same time, there's bits of it that I'm finishing as I go, because I kind of need to see because I don't have that full composition yet, I need to see how to build the painting as we progress to keep the balance and the interest. So you could actually follow along with this video, because I have kept all the painting in. It's just about mixing your colours, you know, having a sort of basic shape to work with. And then you could just follow along, because although I might miss out, like I might show you the start and the finish of an area that I'm doing, I do show you each stage of each area. So I'm hoping that it'll be easy to follow along. It's also at normal speed, because I've already made a sketch of this and that it's such an early stage and I'm really putting down quite large areas. Everything does move fast at this stage. It's also, you know, you're not worried about, oh, I didn't really want that shape quite like that, but you'll deal with that later. That's not important at this stage. What I'm really trying to get in is the areas where I maybe want a bit of stiffness, or I want it to look a bit like it flows, or I want it to look like its direction's a wee bit off, you know. it's that sort of thing that I'm putting in with the paintbrush just now, really. Because there's an awful lot of green on there just now, and I'm hopeful there isn't that much green at the end. There probably is. So this here, this yellow, is kind of what I use as my sort of focal area, I suppose. Because that is the kind of standout colour on here. It's the brightest. So I am a bit more careful about keeping those areas quite defined. When I say defined, what I mean is keeping the yellow and the red and the orange in certain parts of the painting and not just sort of putting bits of it everywhere. So this is me using my one of my skewers. Now this skewer's covered in paint. It's blunt. I mean, you could use a pen that doesn't work anymore. You know, it's something to, you know, sort of put lines into the paint with. You'll notice as well, like, the texture that you can get from that also adds shape to your plant and your edges, and it helps show, you know, if something's going off at an angle or it's twisting, or if it is meant to be, you know, stiffer or more pliable. You know, think about like a woody stem or a petal of a flower. You know, that's quite a difference in how they would behave, if you like. I really love the kind of tropical feel of this painting, and I do think that going to the hothouse in the botanical gardens and actually seeing how, you know, like exotic plants I'm not used to seeing very often, and actually really looking at them from the perspective of a painter, it really was quite amazing, and it's actually boosted my confidence in doing abstract florals, that actually these shapes and edges and textures can be quite flamboyant in some of these plants. Like when you think about like the head of a bird of paradise, I mean, it really is a fiery colour. So the lemon yellow and the indigo make a very good limey green. I do tend to be a bit heavy-handed with the indigo. You really only need a touch of it in that lemon yellow to create that colour. Do you know, sometimes as well, I'll be thinking about how I want that plant to be kind of texture-wise and movement-wise. And I do notice that I adapt my, you know, the speed of which I paint with and the wateriness of the paint. And like, see here when I'm going down with that skewer, having made those sort of brush mark textures with the gesso at the start actually helps you make it a bit more wobbly, because you're actually kind of bumping into sort of ridges that are already there. It's easier for it to be wonky. It's hard to draw a straight line on top of that. So you do get a more natural kind of looking veins. Well, I think they're quite natural looking for my abstract. So the other thing as well is you don't want to just keep putting in the same lines. Ideally, I probably could have done with having different thicknesses of items to scratch in with, because I overused this skewer. Although I did bring in a sort of a thinner point at a later stage, and it did make a difference. So that's something to bear in mind, is a variety of the scratching tools is good as well as the variety of the brushes. Now, so I've got some shape repetitions in there. So that plant that I'd just made, and I kind of made the triangle marks on them, I've got that repeating further down, but it's thinner. And then the woody stem, the dark green woody stem at the top right, I have that repeating on the bottom right. I did make them of a similar size, which isn't ideal. It's a similar size and also it's a similar shaping. But again, that's something, that I can improve on. So here I'm not being overly, like when I put in the long vertical wonky lines I was talking about in the kind of lime green leaf, I was quite slow and deliberate, but then I was doing really quite fast horizontal scratch marks because I wanted them to be much more random looking, and I'm making these ones a bit more curly. I do think these leaves look a bit like jalapenos or chilies, which kind of fits in with the hot theme. So I have some white, and what I do is I kind of, I spray water onto the paint, so I just kind of take some of the liquid out of that and add it to the white, so it's not a stark white. It just adds a subtle hint to the paint. So you'll see here, the way I'm cutting into this sort of woody stem, I am trying to keep the edge, to give it that kind of knobbly edge, rather than just a solid sort of line edge. And here I'm adding in some more definition to it by using a different paintbrush in a slightly bluer shade of the green. I quite enjoyed doing this painting in parts because, especially on a larger piece like this, it's nice to get a wee bit of variety in the kind of paintwork you're doing at that time. Makes you focus on the area more, than I think. So you can see how lovely that stands out. That woody stem on the right against the negative painting whiter background, because the background's really quite solid block colour, but it's been cut into the stem, so it's actually creating the shape of the stem, whereas painting the stem directly on top of that block solid colour, it doesn't come out the same. There's a different look that you get with using negative painting to make your shapes, and it's a look I really like. So this is me, I'm adding some red. I want that to have like a red sort of middle and a yellow orange base, and so but I want it to be like triangles and diamonds. So this is me trying to just add a bit more definition to the shape, adding a bit of variety to the red, the orange and yellow colours. And I do come back to this a few times because it all builds up. And so while it's kind of, I do feel like I'm repeating the same motion over it, but it's creating depth. Do you see how messy my tubs are? That's nothing compared to how they end up. I end up using the sides of the tubs just to make sort of new mixes, but using the old paint mixes to do it. So I really actually enjoy the fact that it's almost like we're getting nearly finished parts of the painting. They're not finished, but it feels like they're much more finished than the rest of the painting. And I find that quite encouraging, actually, because it gives you a wee insight into seeing that while it looks like this just now, it's not going to stay like this, so don't worry. I do use a lot of purples in here because I found that was one of the colours. There was definitely a purple hue to a lot of the kind of leaves and plants in the hothouse in the Botanic Gardens. I'm struggling to define my shapes here, so I find myself going backwards and forwards a wee bit in that area. So what I'm doing is I just felt that woody stem needed a bit more. So that's got like 3 greens on it now. And I just very gently patted a little bit on. It wouldn't have changed the shape or anything. So I'm putting some textures on this, but then I'm going to paint over it when it's dry. So this is me making another kind of woody stem, but it's brown this time. And I'm just showing you that I'm just laying the paint on differently. I'm using a different way with the paintbrush, and that's all I'm doing. And it really does, it's really effective at you know, changing the sort of stiffness of the plant and the edge of the plant as well. Just adding a bit of olive green on. I mean, it is quite repetitive kind of what you do, because you're kind of doing detailed areas, but you're still doing some of the larger areas as well. You know, the larger, looser brushwork. So again, I'm going to do negative painting around that stem, and it'll make it thinner and more defined against the solid block colour. So for all this looks like the solid block colour, it's not. I've just added a little bit of white into the green. And then I'm putting some more line work on top of it. So again, it's just much more effective than putting on green and white paint lines of paint. And then we're blocking in again with the negative painting. I just show you bits of it here because going against the sort of woody stem, you have to, you know, I paint around it like it's tiny little bubbles so that it keeps that look. So with this is the sort of biggest leaf in this sort of, what's it called? I want to say this bundle of leaves, but I know that's wrong. And this bouquet of leaves, we'll go with that. So while I kind of patted quite heavily and quite one after the other for the woody stems, what I'm doing here is I'm holding the paintbrush loosely. I'm just very lightly patting and I'm moving very fast. And it's while I'm doing the same motion, but because of the differences in the way I'm holding it and the speed with that I'm moving and the different size and bristles of the paintbrush, it just changes the look. This one kind of makes me think of rows of knitting actually, but as they build up they lose that look. It's quite, some of the leaves I noticed in the hothouse of the botanical gardens, they were actually, they were like so heavily embossed and almost velvety. And that's kind of the look that I was going for with this one. Sometimes I kind of, especially if I was pressing lightly, I was kind of working on top of the wet paint and then other times on top of the dry paint. And just when you get so used to using the acrylics and, you know, this particular brand of paints, if you like, you get used to how they behave. And you can be a wee bit more confident about when you can get away with maybe using them. When the paint's still wet to when it's not. But because I'm dotting as well, I'm not fully colouring in a large area and then going right over the top with another colour. I'm kind of patting them next to each other or slightly overlapping in areas. This doesn't show up very well because it's quite a thin watery paint, so it wasn't quite ready for some texture to be added. I did notice that I worked a lot of tone on tone as well, like for example building up layers of sort of different shades of purple or different shades of green, etc. Whereas normally I'm very much complementary, go for the opposite. I wonder if I'm becoming more refined. Only in my painting style. So I'm pressing even lighter this time and sparser. You know, I'm doing less sort of lands, if you like, on the paper with the brush. This was one of my favourite parts actually of the painting because I liked the fact that you knew it wasn't a flat leaf by looking at it. It was more than just a sort of how the veins are on the leaf. You could tell that was a thick leaf. So at this stage here, I'm kind of just going over some of the larger shapes again. Like, for example, here I want it to look like it's got a lot of the sort of fine hairs on it. A lot of the plants in the hothouse had a lot of fine hairs on them. And so that's something that I wanted to show on here. It's also, like the way I'm using the paintbrush, I'm dabbing lightly and quickly. And that's a flat head paintbrush, so it's giving sort of, it's almost like tiny little leaves on top of that. I also want it to look like it's sort of got two different directions to it. Because I wanted this flower to look like it was like a, you know, it was completely round, like a sort of a tent. I don't know what the word is. Like a cup, an upside down cup. You know, it's hollow in the middle. And those leaves and the yellow flowers go all the way around. So here I put down some very watery paint. And I'm just patting on top of it with some tissue paper. So I'm not drying it and I'm patting very gently. But what I'm trying to do is kind of flatten it out and give it a subtle pattern. So here I'm adding to that sort of thick embossed leaf. And I want it to look like it's either got like little sort of seed pods hanging from it, or that it's almost like it's there to protect what's underneath. And then so I'm putting another stem in, but I want this to be more like a stem and not like the woody stems. So I don't want it to look as stiff and as hardy, as structured, if you like. I want it to look like it's quite flimsy. And I'm just bringing a bit of the colour back into the leaf. So this is more or less pure indigo blue, and I am that's a round pointed brush, and it's a very soft brush. It's almost like in fact I use it for watercolours, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to just very gently because put the seed pods down with it, just as little dots, because at the end of the day you know, I do want it to look a bit vulnerable, but I want it to have texture. So we're working more on this side of the painting now that's still pink. The other side was quite sort of strong defined shapes, the plants on that side, but this side I want it to be quite as if it's lots of strands that are intertwined with each other, and as if it's more flowery basically. What this bit here is, I want this to look like sort of fine tendrils that are holding the sort of bottom structure up. So you'll notice that I'm moving very slowly with the paintbrush. I'm pressing gently and I'm just trying to be quite loose with the line work. And what I'm doing is I'm putting down a few different colours so that, you know, when we cut into it, there's going to be, it's not just going to be a sort of solid line colour. There's going to be so many variations in it. So this is me adding the diamonds to this yellow sort of tubular cup flower. That's what we're calling it, a tubular cup flower. Anyway, so I've added these diamonds, but they're a bit too low down. So, you know, we go back to that because I want these red sort of zigzag triangles. I want them to be quite a thin band. So I need to bring those diamonds higher up to meet that. I'm also going to, I make the diamonds sort of different widths, different lengths, and I also put the points, the angles differently as well, because I want to give that illusion that this plant is rotating, that it's not flat. I do have to fill them in completely purple this time though, because I couldn't work out what was what, because I'd done so much already. But I go over it again with the yellow because I do want them to be yellow. Oh, I do like when you do the cutting in with the negative painting because it just tidies everything up. And I'm just trying to make it look a bit more natural. The way petals would hang if they're kind of drooping. They wouldn't be like... Well, they would have twists and turns in them, wouldn't they? So I'm putting this yellow paint on quite thickly so that I can then almost draw mini diamond shapes inside. So these first couple of petals that I've been working on there, the texture goes in really nicely, but then the definition starts to get less and less. And I actually quite liked that because I thought it's actually making it look like the petals I'm working on now are actually further away because they're less defined. So that was actually a good thing that happened. I'm just adding some sort of looseness to this area here by adding in some of the indigo sort of hanging tendrils from it, because that area there is quite boxy and it looks quite solid, so I'm hoping that'll just loosen it up a bit. I'll add a bit more to that later on. So this area here that I'm working on, this is a sort of repetitive shape of the sort of diamond petals, but what I'm doing is I'm using a different colour. They're a bit longer, they're more meant to be in a sort of flat line rather than in a cup shape, and I want them to look more translucent, more broken and tired looking, I suppose. A bit more wispy. So here, I'm kind of adding more definition here, but I still want to keep this area really loose looking because it's quite hard to stop yourself tidying it all up because it's such a large area. But I want the negative painting to actually define the overall structure, because I want to keep it loose and whimsical looking, like fragile looking. I do feel like I have left in so much of the process, and maybe it's a bit repetitive, but I also think that it'd be good for anybody that actually wants to sort of follow along or use some of the techniques that I've used in this painting, because we have used a lot of techniques. Sort of used the opaque paint to create the solid background that's the negative painting. We've used the negative painting. We've been using scratching tools to create texture. You know, we've been using the paintbrushes in different ways to create a different type of plant. You know, some plants that are more solid, some that are more loose, some that are more fragile, etc. We've mixed the colours of the paint. I mean, it's quite hard to believe all this was, you know, it's just 3 colours of paint and white. So this is just another sort of woody stem. I want this, so see the kind of embossed plant, and it's got that kind of red, looks like an avocado stone. So I want that to be repeated in, you know, the sort of flower that's within the leaf shape that's above where I'm working just now. So I am slowing down a bit here so that I can try and sort of create the shape, so that when it does come to the negative painting, I do have something to kind of work around. I'm adding a bit more yellow to make it more vibrant in this area, because with the purple underneath, it was dulling down the yellow. So just another layer of yellow just to brighten it up a bit. I'm obviously going round with the yellow to areas just now, I think. Yeah. So I'm adding some texture here, but I didn't really like how I added it. So all that you do when you do that is you paint over it. If you paint over it very lightly, you'll keep some of that texture. If you paint over it with a bit more pressure, you'll just take it all away. It's entirely up to yourself. I think I took it all away and added so that I can cut into it again. Do you see how that shape is similar to that embossed leaf next to it though? But they're very different as well. That's more the shape I wanted. So this actually takes a very long time to do, to create these kind of fine tendril shapes that I want. And my preference is always to work with a paintbrush that's slightly too large. So working with this smaller paintbrush was, you know, it was therapeutic though, but it took some getting used to. So I'm trying, I didn't really succeed at this. I'm trying to make the edges of this more raggedy. And all I did really with that tool, I was trying to use it to sort of put more fine lines in, but all I did was actually spread the white paint about further. I'm just adding more green onto that sort of woody stem shape. So do you see how I'm patting around the edges there? So the edges in this painting are actually very important. It's part of what makes it the type of painting it is. It's what adds to its abstract look, because I feel like I've kind of took a lot of the features of the plants that I've seen, but then what I've done is I've kind of exaggerated them. So what I realised was this left-hand side of the painting, it's actually hard to paint and for you to see what I'm painting. But I do rotate the picture round, so you do see, I show you the processes of how I cut into those small areas later on, because my hand keeps getting in the way at this side. So there's a lot going on there. I've got those kind of purple teardrop shapes, and then I've got a lot of the green kind of stems. I've got some green little leaf shapes. And what I'm doing when I'm cutting in with the paint is I'm more thinking about the shape rather than going round each colour, if you like. So some of them, it kind of gives the illusion of those purple shapes are like sort of ovals. Even though some of the green will be caught in amongst it and some of the pink. And it's to me, that's part of what makes it abstract, because, we've got the kind of mixture of colours that are going on, even if they're not quite part of that actual flower. I hope that made sense. It made sense to me, but that doesn't mean anything. So it's easier to see what I'm doing when I turn the painting upside down. Next time I do a big painting like this, what I'll do is I'll actually move the camera over to the other side. So I cut this flower in with a negative painting, and it ends up looking a bit like a sort of cartoon Christmas pudding. But I do fix it at the end. Do you see what I mean? I think though, because I end up doing like probably about 3 layers of that white negative painting colour, just to make it solid and to let everything stand out. And I think what's happened with the kind of Christmas pudding flower is that it's a bit of a thicker layer of paint I've put on than I had in other areas, so it really stood out. So I'm just trying to show you parts where I am trying to sort of define the shape of the kind of vines that are hanging here, but I'm kind of not overly relying on the colours to define how I make my shapes. That's what I was trying to say earlier. So as you can see, there's a lot going on plant-wise in this area where I'm working all these kind of stalks, and I just want to pull out some that, that give it the shape. But because all the other colours are there, it will give the illusion of depth, as if it's, some of the leaves are behind other leaves, etc. So although I've not shown you all parts of this negative painting, It's basically the same technique that I use throughout. I just decide at each stage what's going to look best to be left in and what type of edge I want. I do need to think more about the pink though. I don't know if I should have left more pink around the edges. But I think because I'd put on so many layers of the other colours, it would actually be hard to leave a lot of the pink on. I think to leave the pink edges, I would have had to have kept the painting much looser, which is something I want to do. I tried to keep the illusion of these vines being connected, so there's always a link. But there is a couple of areas where I think the white kind of created a gap, but that's fine. I really like how this bit turned out. I think that's a really, really nice shape in there. You'll notice up the top right hand side, well it's now the bottom left hand side, that it's quite grey there. And what I do is I go over it all with a kind of white with a bit of the green in it. Very subtle hint of the green in it. And that, but that greyness kind of stayed. And I quite liked that because it just added a bit of a shadow effect. Oh, you're going to see it. This is the last part that I do. So do you see there, I'm making that quite loose. And it just helps balance the darkness of those purple vines going down the left hand side. But that's it. Oh, I hope you enjoyed and thanks very much for watching and take care and I hope to see you soon. Bye.